Hello, guys. Welcome back to From Idea to Outline to Finished Book, because that seriously is the goal of this community. This is why I built this community, is to make sure that we can continue writing, even if you're on your second or third book. I think you always need to refresh your skills. So not only with your writing craft, but also with your creative mindset. And sometimes it's the craft part, knowing that will help your mindset, because at least now you have an idea of kind of how stories are structured. And that's why I built this module in particular, to give you, when you're trying to think of the next idea. I hope these kind of prompts will get you to the next part of the book, and then you can kind of use this format to sort of get to the final finished product. So you came back, you've already watched the first 3 lessons. Today we're going to do lesson 4, 5, and 6. And so let's get started with lesson 4, Story Structure 101. Look, even the most creative ideas need a container. Structure isn't about limiting your creativity. It's about giving your story a backbone. When I used to write my first screenplays, I didn't really know a lot about structure. I just kind of, I have an idea, and I knew what it was. I knew there was Act 1 and Act 2 and Act 3, but I really didn't think I needed to follow that game plan. And then I read Save the Cat, and it taught me a lot. It was a lot to take in, because when you're new to this kind of structure, it sounds invasive to the creative process. You're like, no, I know how this story should go. But for instance, every story technically has these, because that's what gives the story good pacing. And books are like roadmaps. Okay. Now I know now we have GPS, so we don't have to worry about that. But even when you come up with a plan to take a road trip, even though you're using GPS. But you still have to come up with, okay, we're going to wake up tomorrow and we're going to drive, this far, and it'll take us about this amount of time. So we need to leave at this point so we can get there in this time. And if we need to take a detour, we still can, because we have a little extra time to spare. That's your outline for the road trip. Now, what happens on the road trip? Sometimes that doesn't happen that way, but you still kind of stay to the structure of what you still have the same destination, but maybe you took a different detour. Maybe your car broke down, so there's things that get in the way, and they're going to come along, but the outline kind of still gives you the direction that you want to go. That's why I said stories act the same way, right? So think of a movie like The Lion King, and at the beginning, Act 1, we're looking at Simba's carefree childhood, but also in his first act, we're starting to see the character's problems. So he's carefree, but until he starts to notice that there are some problems around him. Then we move into the second act, where it's a lot darker and it's a lot more unsure, and where Scar takes over the entire world. And it gets that's where it went from this beautiful African prairie, to this dark gray area. So that's what's happening. And then we get to the final act, where there's a climax, and he eventually takes the throne. So, and that's your story. And when they wrote the story, that's how they were thinking of it. They didn't just write all this stuff's just going to happen in the middle, and they're just going to float around. That's where you get stuck in the second act. So, for instance, I like to watch TV shows, especially newer ones today, because they're structured very to the act system. Sometimes they have exactly 8 episodes, and so you'll notice exactly how this works right through this, because that's what they're using. Maybe in episode 1, there might be a hook, and some people will be like, that's the inciting incident, but that's usually not, in my opinion. I've argued this with some other people, but it's usually right at the end of that first episode where you get the inciting incident. Episode 2, you're going to end with the end of Act 1. And what does that mean? A lot of times people like to say, when you're going to Act 2, you're going into the adventure now. That's no matter what kind of story you're writing. You're going from this one land to an adventure land. That doesn't go for just adventure stories, obviously. So then you have episode 3 and 4, which lead to what I call 2A, the end of 2A, some sort of reflection that's going to go back, kind of reverse itself. And by the end of episode 6, you're getting to the third act. So you're finally getting towards that climax, and you're moving forward. So when you watch shows like this, a perfect example, if you've never seen it, watch the show Beef on Netflix. It's a perfectly executed structure, and it's a fun show to watch. It's a little crazy, and it really sticks to this plot structure, and you can see why it's such a good story, and how perfect pacing is what you're looking for. All right, lesson 5, creating a chapter map, or chapter table of contents, whatever you want to call it. And this will be kind of like your beginning stages of an outline. I like to think of the chapter map as like the skeleton of your book. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it will help you from getting lost. So the simplest version of a chapter map or a chapter table of contents is just write chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, so on, and then write a sentence that tells you what's going to happen in that chapter. And I like to end with the second sentence that shows you like how it's going to end, and then I do that, and so then I pick up from that point. So what's going to happen in the following chapter, and you can just sit there for a couple of hours one day and do this, and eventually you're going to find yourself at the end of your story, and you're like, wow, now that because when you see it like that, now you have a little more confidence to start writing. You still have to write, but it's more fun. You're not totally structured. You don't know what's going to happen from you say this is going to happen in the story, but how does that play out? That's where you just kind of sprint through and write. But having that skeleton is so crucial. I remember, using this method for my last book, which is about a road trip, and so it was inspired by a road trip that I had taken with my best friend, and we went from Philadelphia to Arizona. But in the book that I wrote, two different characters, different story but similar, um, and they go from Philadelphia to LA. So I started going through this idea of the chapter maps and going, okay, so this is going to be, I know how to structure this sort of because I know it's a trip from New York to LA, or that's where it's supposed to go, right? So you start writing this out and you start to see how the story will go. It gives you the confidence to know that you can get to the end of your story just by using this. Now you just have to write everything in the middle. So lesson 6, adding depth. This is when your book really starts to feel alive, when you start adding these depth, these layers to your story. So this comes after you've done your character map and now you're starting to write. So you don't really have to totally overthink this right now, but just keep in mind like things like subplots and character arcs, because just like your entire story has an arc, so does every main character, especially even some sub characters, and then there are like little mini subplots within this entire book. So this is kind of the fun part. Sometimes this just happens on its own. You're going to start to see that because since you already know what's going to happen in this chapter, but how does it get to there? How does it get to that end sentence? So that's the fun part. That's where you want to just use your creativity. This is where we sprint through and say, this is how I feel this part should go, and this is where it ends right here. So I know that. I know where I'm sprinting to. So lesson 6, adding depth. This comes after you've done your character map and now you're starting to write. So you don't really have to totally overthink this right now, but just keep in mind like things like subplots and character arcs, because just like your entire story has an arc, so does every main character, especially even some sub characters, and then there are like little mini subplots within this entire book. So this is kind of the fun part. Sometimes this just happens on its own. You're going to start to see that because since you already know what's going to happen in this chapter, but how does it get to there? How does it get to that end sentence? So that if you're working on nonfiction, it's kind of, you still want to structure it, and really having a lot of research, examples, anything that you can use to show off your ability to understand the topic that you're talking about. And like I said, right, this is going to be not as long of a lesson. Don't overthink. So I'm telling you a lot right now. Sometimes that could be overwhelming. That's why I said, let the story come. In my opinion, your first time around, you should be more sprinting through it and not overthinking. Like you have that character map to start with. So build on that. And that's the fun part, just building on that and giving yourself this time, whatever time you have to write this story, and in that going off into this whatever world you've created. The depth will come later. It will come sometimes in the second and third draft, or sometimes you have to do a fourth draft, or fifth draft. So this depth will come. These subplots will come. This character arc will get polished, and everything will come together, and you'll have this beautiful book.